Hi everyone, this is Tanya from Flying Dog Studio. Thanks so much for joining me. In this video, we're going to take a look at shading and textures in watercolor. We are going to be painting this cute little French village. And as we get started here, I'm using my Winsor & Newton half pan filled pocket set, along with my Royal and Langnickel Zen Series brushes. I do have a flat brush there, a size 8 and a size 2. And the first thing we're going to do with this whole piece, I've already been over the entire thing with water to get the sizing out, and I've let it dry. And there's my water. I have one for rinsing a brush and one for mixing. I am going to put a wash over the entire piece, as you see here, making it nice and shiny. And then I'm going to be doing just a one color wash over the entire piece, and I'm going to be using the cadmium free yellow. Now the piece is not primarily yellow, but it does have a lot of yellow undertones. It looks as if this may have been sunset, and so you get that golden color to everything, kind of a golden tone. Now we're coming back with some blues and greens and reds and lots of colors on top, but having that golden color underneath just gives this an entirely different feel. Once I get the shutters done here, we're coming through and putting just a light wash of color on everything in the piece. And I'm letting things dry, so I let the yellow dry, and I will let, before I added any color, and I will let everything else dry as well before we come back and start adding those extra layers of paint on top to create shadows and texture. One thing that I am doing a little bit differently with this demonstration than I do with my other demonstrations is I am putting the colors in their separate places on the palette. And I do have the names on the screen as I'm adding other colors, but I am putting colors side by side that I will be mixing together. For instance, I had the blue and the brown together, and then I brought them together in the center to mix them. I thought it might be a little bit easier for you to see what I'm doing if I do it that way, and you can keep up with my color mixing. So I'm bringing that red, that crimson down and mixing it with the yellow, and I'm coming back to the little terracotta pots. Glass in windows is always a little tricky to paint, and we're going to be using Payne's Gray. Most generally you get like a blue-gray feel when you're looking at a window and you're seeing the reflection, but we will come back. Now this looks extremely dark, but remember the colors are darker when we put them on, and once it's absorbed into the paper they get lighter. So we'll come back and we will add some other colors to those once it's dry and kind of give those reflections. So each window is going to be a little bit different. That's why I'm adding the ivory black in with the Payne's Gray, because of shadows, because of just different angles of the glass, and they have different reflections in them. And some of these were actually little businesses, so I think they might have been closed. There weren't any lights on inside. So that's what you're seeing with the windows that I'm working on. The street between the buildings had basically a pink tint to it, and that's what you're seeing here. I am doing just a wet on wet wash and covering everything. I'm not worried about anything bleeding into other stuff, because these colors, we want them to kind of mix and do their thing. So I am going to be adding not just the color you're seeing there, but I'm going to be adding other colors in on this street and just letting them run together and do their own thing. because, you know, a street is not going to be pristine clean. It's going to have dark spots and light patches, and so that's what you're seeing here. The dark in the background, it got darker as it went back. There are shadows on the street. Now you can see that at this point it has dried, and you can see how it has dried on there, and all the colors have moved together. That gives me a good base to come back and put some highlight colors on. We are mixing up our building color, and all of the buildings will be this basic color. All the storefronts, all the building fronts had the basic color on there. You can see I'm starting at an angle to paint, and that's because there is some sunlight that's going to be coming in on the top side of that building and creating kind of a highlight, and the rest of this part of the building is a little more shaded. Now, this is the point where we are going to start adding some textures, and if you caught my previous video, and I'll link that one down below, where I am using a couple of different kinds of salt to experiment with creating granulation in a piece. That's what we're going to be doing here. I'm actually going to be using iodized salt. I'm not going to be using sea salt. I'm going to use the finer grain because I want it to spread out, and I want this to be kind of subtle. So we're going to start, and once it's nice and wet and has all the color on there, there we go, I'm going to do that part, and then I'm going to come to the other building fronts and do those, but I don't want it to dry on me. I want to go ahead and get some on there, and I'm going to come back then and work it around with a little bit of water, and we'll talk to that one about that when we get there, because I want it to be subtle. I want to have dark spots and light spots, and that salt will do that for me. As it absorbs the water, it also absorbs the pigment, and it moves it from one place to another place, and it works beautifully for adding texture. So I'm adding a little more water to my paint mix as I'm coming across, because as these buildings get closer to me, they're getting a little bit lighter, and farther away there's a little more shadow on it. So that's what you're seeing here. That's why it's getting lighter as it's coming toward us. Now the buildings are painted, and I've put the salt on, and we're just going to let that salt work its magic. You can already tell where it is starting to create some texture in there. I'm not going to blow dry it. That's one trick. We don't want to blow dry it. We'll blow all the salt off the paper and into places that we don't want the salt. So I'm just going to ignore that area and work on painting some more of the bricks around and the street, and just getting some more layers on top. Little bit of salt in the street, so I'm having to wipe that away. Like I said, the iodized salt, it's a small granule, and when you use it, you can try to control it, but it will go everywhere, so you just kind of have to be careful with that. As I've said in previous video about using salt for granulation, one trick is to make sure you don't overuse it. So I've used it on the buildings, and I'm going to come back and use it on one little spot on the street, and it's this area I am painting right here. I'm going to put a little salt on that in a bit to kind of create, it had more of a concrete feel, so it had some little sprinkles of white through it, and I don't want to paint that in. I want to create that with the texture of the salt. So you're going to see that happening in a few minutes. And again, in these areas, I'm painting wet next to wet with different colors, but I'm not concerned about those colors bleeding out into the street. I want kind of a walked on, used, dirty look in the street. So that's what we're doing here. While the street is drying and all the little areas we just painted are working and drying out, I am coming with a wet brush and going back over those buildings, just plain water in there. And what I'm doing is I'm moving that salt around. Now, each time I come in with a wet brush, little salt granules are getting on my paintbrush. So what you're not seeing off camera is I'm wiping my brush on a towel, putting it back in the water, and then coming back to the building. It may seem a little counterproductive, but as you're about to see, we still have those wonderful textures. Everything's dry here, and you can see where there are light and dark spots. I will be coming back later and putting more color on top of the building. And again, it's not counterproductive doing that because I do have dark spots underneath now and light spots, and it gives the buildings kind of a worn feel. It puts a little bit of age on them. We don't want anything too perfect on this. This is more of a loose drawing and painting, so that helps us out by adding those textures in. Finally adding some green to all the greenery in this piece. So I'm using sap green as my base green, and I'm going to be mixing some other colors like Payne's gray and also that cadmium for yellow. And I'm not sure what this is I'm painting. It was in the picture, so we're adding that in with kind of a forest green that we've made there. So I'm coming back and I'm doing wet on dry, and I'm using quite a bit of water in my brush because as I did with the road, I'm just picking up colors that are going to work together, and I'm just letting them blend together. This is just my base coat. I'm going to come back and give it a little more definition. Now, we could leave it like this. If you wanted to paint it simple and not put a lot of detail and texture into it, you absolutely could paint it like this, and that would be a wonderful way to leave it as a really loose painting. I did want to add a little more texture by adding some layers of color, so you're going to see that once this gets dry. Once again, this is like a mass of a vine that is coming around, just a mass of greenery. And I'm going to put all kinds of colors in here. Used a lot of water on my brush. This is wet on dry. I'm using a lot of water on my brush and I'm just tapping that color in. There are a lot of shadows in there. So I'm just putting all of the darker green in, and I have the lighter green spread throughout, and we're even going to use some of that cadmium for yellow and drop that in because I want to come back later and put those individual petals on there, or leaves I should say. I did not draw those in. I wanted them not to be the focus of the piece, but I did want to acknowledge them. So by not outlining them, not going around them with the pen or putting a lot of hatch marks in there, then I can make those part of the piece, but they're not going to be the main focus. So just going to let all of those colors do whatever they want to do, and that will be perfectly fine. Just adding a little more color over here. My yellow got a little light on me. Like I said, once these colors dry, they start to get lighter, so I want a little more color there. We are coming to one of my favorite parts, and that is painting shadows. For me, shadows just really bring some depth and magic and believability to a piece, and that is what this is doing for our piece. Now, as you can see the window that I'm working on currently, as I put those shadows on the top part of the window, it really punched that completely back. It showed us that is like a little alcove that the window is in, and it really pushes it back. All I'm using here is some Payne's Gray, occasionally with a lot of water on my brush, because remember, Payne's Gray is a very strong color. I'm also allowing some black and a little bit of the brown. I believe that was burnt umber I had on there. I'm allowing those to mix together. You don't want to use black, just straight black on shadows. I know a lot of my students, that's what I've had to pull them away from in the past. We normally think shadows are dark, so we have to use the darkest color. Actually, blue is a really good color to use for shadows, and it depends on the time of day, it depends on the season, it depends on if it's grass or if it's snow that you're painting shadows on. But always be mindful of what those shadows look like and the colors in them. That's why I am putting, and you can do this two different ways. You can put the shadows down and then add the colors of the buildings on top, or you can do the colors of the buildings and put the shadows on top. So I'm kind of doing it two ways. I've put the color down first, then I'm putting the shadows, and then I'm going to come back and put some more color of these objects on top of that. For instance, the door has some shadows on it now, the little door that's swinging out into the street. I'm going to come back and put some more brown on top of that once the door is dry. So you can layer these colors however you like. You'll end up with something very similar in the end. So it's sort of a technique, artist by artist, however you want to put these down. As I've said with my digital art videos, there's no wrong way to do something. Do what works best for you. working a few more shadows with that Payne's Gray. And as I said, and as you can see on there, Payne's Gray is a very strong color. If you put color down like this and it gets a little too strong for you, all you have to do is rinse your brush, wipe it off, get a little bit of water on it, and then you can just move that color on around. This is 100% cotton paper, so it makes it a little easier to do that. If you're using some of the paper that's not 100% cotton, maybe it's more of the cellulose type paper, then it's a little harder to do this. This is cold press, so cold press does dry quickly, but the 100% cotton allows you to move these colors around a bit more. Now, as I'm adding all of these shadows in, and all of these colors that are on top, as we're layering the colors, again, keep in mind that what's underneath is already dry. You may not see that drying time on here, but it has had time to dry. I don't know if you noticed, but I put some salt on that little spot that I said I was going to be putting salt on. I said earlier I would be doing that there. I have done that, and I'm not going to come back and rinse that like I did the buildings. I want that to be a rough granulation on there, so I'm going to leave that as it is, and I'm just putting some various markings in here. This was kind of a long piece, so I'm going to let it dry and come back for part 2 and finish it up in that one. Thanks so much for watching. Put your questions down below, and I'll see you in the next one.